Dr. Wellner, how are you? So glad to. This is my colleague and my friend, and so I'm getting really excited. I'm going to pause for a moment and just turn my video off so that we can give our friends the proper introduction. So Dr. Wellner and Dr. Walker, if you want to come on camera, now is your time. So tonight we are going to end with just, like I said, two of our friends, our colleagues and our friends, and I'm just so happy to be able to introduce both of them. First, we have Dr. Andrea Walker, and she's a special education teacher in the Georgia public school system. She has 13 years of experience and counting. Dr. Walker is an adjunct professor for Grand Canyon University, and she teaches undergraduate classes for the Early Childhood and Special Education Department. Dr. Walker's passion and expertise in the field of special education are emotional, behavioral disorders, intellectual disabilities, and mental health advocacy for special education teachers. Her dissertation, entitled Overcoming Multiple Roles and Responsibilities in Rural Southwest Georgia, provides an in-depth research study on how special education teachers are maintaining and completing their responsibilities with limited resources. And Dr. Laurie Wellner is an academic director at Penn Foster and has worked in the field of education for the past 28 years. She specializes in issues regarding autism, special education, and organizational institutional leadership, ADHD, educationally related mental health services, and the successful communication and collaboration with stakeholders for the improvement of the educational process. She is an adjunct professor at Claremont Graduate University in Toro College in the areas of leadership, diversity, inclusion, and special education. She has served on so many committees and just has a wealth of knowledge. I really encourage you to go into the agenda and read her bio because, man, she's filled with great information and experiences. So check that out after the presentation. Ladies, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was so generous. And I wanted to add to that I'm really lucky to be presenting today with Dr. Walker. We have a little connection over the last couple of years, and I served as her dissertation chair. And so over what about 2 years or so, Dr. Walker?
Yep.
And so we have just a little relationship, and we are so blessed to sort of be here and working together beyond her doctorate, and I'm thrilled to be here with her today.
Well, and I'm thrilled to be here with you. She got me through the whole dissertation process. So it was grueling.
She did great. So thank you for the opportunity. We're excited to be here with all of you as well. Our topic today is tips for co-teachers in the early childhood education setting. And we know that many of our many teachers in general, I'll just sort of broaden that scope, oftentimes don't have a significant amount of special education background so that they can be educated and feel confident in the classroom. And so we wanted to provide some tips for co-teachers, specifically for those folks that are finding themselves in inclusive settings, and that means for our general education students and those who have disabilities or suspected disabilities, so some behavior problems, maybe developmental problems. And so those challenges certainly are part of our jobs as teachers. And so we're going to cover a few of these areas today. We're going to obviously do introductions. We're going to talk a little bit about what's called Part C of this big federal umbrella of legislation that drives a lot of these services and platforms that students are educated within. We're going to talk about response to intervention and how that works. We're going to talk about some inclusive practices and strategies for success. And then we'll open it up to any questions that you might have, time considering as well. So lots of good stuff, and we're excited to be here. So thanks so much.
All right. So We're going to start off just kind of giving you a little bit of background, history of special education, where it has come from. Special education has evolved from public law 92-142. Sorry, y'all, I've got brain fog the last couple of days. But it was passed in the 1970s to guarantee all students the right to a public education. Since that time, it's evolved to what we know and understand as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And if you have been in education even for 3 months, you have heard that term, and it can be a very scary term. But before students even get to elementary age, there's what we call Part C of that early intervention, where students start to get diagnosed even earlier, which is beginning from birth up through 36 months. And at that time, once those students are identified as having some sort of disability, whether it's autism, intellectual disabilities, whatever it might be, they are, and IFSP is created, an individualized family service plan. And that just helps the child get a head or leg up into their education career so that they are not as behind when they enter kindergarten. Those services can include anything from family training, counseling so that the family understands the diagnosis, speech therapy, physical therapies, hearing loss services. So with that, then that plan then follows that student into the school system, where the school system then builds on that to be able to identify the student's weaknesses and strengths. But what happens if that student gets to school and has yet to be identified as having some sort of disability? This is where that RTI tier comes into place. So the first thing you as an educator needs to do is document, document, document. We cannot stress the word document enough when it comes to special education. And with all that documentation, you're going to collaborate with parents to provide them the tools and strategies to help them at home. That documentation will have additional differentiated instruction, because that documentation allows you as the teacher to take that student from tier 1, which is where everybody's learning, and placing them into a tier 2 categorization, which means they are getting more structured. Structured is not the right word, but more differentiated instruction, basically, whether that's in small groups that are fluid and homogeneous or heterogeneous, or just based on whatever skill deficit they are experiencing. So what happens if I have moved that student into tier 2 and they're still not responding to all that cool stuff that I'm doing with them? So the student continues to struggle. The teacher continues to document. Again, that documentation becomes overwhelming. The student continues to struggle. So with all that documentation, the teacher is able to refer that student to what we call the student support team. And that student support team meets and says, looks at all the documentation and says, great, we see that this student is struggling. Everything that you have put into place is not working. We need to figure out what's going on with this child cognitively. So then the student support team takes that information and sends a referral to the school psychologist and says, hey, we don't know where to go from here. Can you do some additional testing? Let us know what might be going on. Once that testing is completed, the team reconvenes to go over the analysis, get the results. And at that point, that team decides based on the results to move that student into tier 3. Tier 3 is what is now considered special education intensive instruction services.
So once that happens, and we're giving a little bit of history so that we can get to the tips and all the fun stuff, much, if not every single piece of this is driven by that federal legislation. So as Dr. Walker explained, this formal assessment occurs, right? So the question really is, what happens once that student qualifies or is eligible for specialized services in tier 3? There's assessment of family members. There's a review of the home environment. There's communication between home and school. So teachers are part of this process, as well as the family or caregivers, depending on their own situation at home. And there's a lot of information, as you know, as educators, that can be obtained through that discussion, through those questionnaires, through that data collection process. So at that point, there's what's called an IEP case manager, someone who oversees all of this information, the meetings that are scheduled, the services that are provided, the frequency by which students are receiving those services. And in true early childhood, often, as Andrea explained, it's a home visit situation, not always in the preschool classrooms or early childhood classrooms. It's often at home because parents may need those strategies as well. The consistency between home and school is hugely important. And so the specially designed instruction, that's that intensive services, depending on the areas of identified weaknesses, that's then provided. And so we really try in the process to customize, first to identify what does the child need to catch up, to support their behaviors, to whatever the deficits may be, to really customize that instruction for them. And then the general education teachers, whether it's elementary, whether it's high school, whether it's in the early childhood setting, that general education teacher's role is to really understand and be able to provide those strategies in the classroom. And so the question that's often asked is, gosh, I'm a preschool teacher. I don't know anything about this. And so that's pretty much the purpose and the reason that we wanted to come today, is to provide just a really basic platform for you. The general education talks with the case manager, and they provide that early intervention support. So helping those babies and toddlers with those developmental delays or the disabilities, depending on the severity of what their needs are. And so that's a lot of what we're talking about. And we've listed a few of these areas that are focused not only in those individual family services planned or in the IEP, which the IFSP is really early childhood. And then once they become school age, it turns into what's called an IEP, individual education program. So these areas are physical areas, physical supports, depending on if there's an orthopedic impairment. Is there a cerebral palsy? Did the poor baby hit their head early on in their career and they're having trouble reaching, rolling, crawling, or walking, right? Those typical milestones that we expect our babies to meet. Cognitive, just as Dr. Walker explained, some of those sort of learning opportunities, problem solving, and then we talk about communication, listening, language, articulation, starting to really speak and use the language effectively in their environment. The social emotional areas, play. And we all know that play is such an important aspect of development. and that feeling secure, feeling happy, feeling that they can really explore their environment as a very basic platform, as a learning process. And then a lot of times we're focused on self-help, right? How do we get our babies to learn how to dress, tie our shoes? If we have an orthopedic impairment, it's often an area where we need to support those areas. And it could be a combination of all of those or some of them, depending on the needs. So one way to focus on that is if you're lucky enough to be paired with a special educator, and I always call it the marriage between a special educator and a general educator in early childhood, or have access to consultation, is what we call co-teaching, right? So we talk about co-planning, co-assessing, and co-teaching, and that triad of activities that happens, you really have to be married, almost have that relationship with your partner in this process. And there's a lot of different models, and we wanted to talk about and sort of give you a brief overview. If it's something that you're doing, maybe try something different. If it's something you're exploring as a strategy, there's all of these areas that we're going to talk about today. We have little tiny visuals so that you can sort of see how it works.
All right, so these first two, one teach, one observe, and one teach, one assist. If you look at the visual, they're going to look very, very similar. In a lot of cases, if you don't have a special education background, they look identical. But there is a slight difference. The one teach, one observe, they're only, the teacher teaches, and that can be the general education teacher, teacher of record, or that can be the special education teacher. The other person in that is observing. That is all they're doing. They're taking notes. What's going on in the class? What's going on with that student? Trying to figure out where the breakdown is in the learning process. Whereas with the one teach, one assist, again, one person takes that lead role, the general education teacher or the special education teacher. It doesn't matter. And then the other person is walking around the room and helping students individually, making sure that they stay on track. A lot of times that one teach, one assist works very well with those students with ADHD, because all you need to do is kind of tap them on the shoulder, or, kind of rub their back a second, and it brings them back. A lot of districts do not like either one of these models because they feel like the person doing the observing or the assisting is nothing more than a teacher's aide, when in actuality, it is way more than that. There's a bigger role that's being played within that. So as Laurie said, you've got to get that marriage, and don't just assume that because you got that special education teacher, they don't know the content. Switch it up. That way the students also know that you both have equivalent and you are both equal within that setting.
So the other two here that we want to talk about is parallel teaching and alternative teaching. And as you can see, there's some similarities in the models, but at the top, the parallel teaching is where both teachers are active in the instruction. They're active in sort of redirection. They're both sort of an equal partner. And what that does is maybe divide up into smaller groups, the classroom, which is sometimes more manageable. The key to this is that both teachers need to have that mastery of content, like Andrea was just talking about. And that does take some planning. That pacing also has to be in place. And the alternative teaching is a little bit similar, but different, where the one teacher is working with a larger group, and then the other teacher is working with a more specified, maybe it's a group that's practicing a certain skill. And going back to that previous list of skills, it could be communication, it could be sharing, it could be anything that we know that our students sometimes have trouble with. So it's a little bit different, where parallel teaching is with pretty much the whole group. And then alternative teaching is sort of separating out to maybe more structured or more intensive redirection or support for the needs, similar needs.
So then the last two, station teaching and team teaching. Station teaching, if you've been in education at all, station teaching used to be the big go-to for every elementary classroom. Every principal wanted to see you station teaching. But the cool thing is when you have that second person in the room with you, that station teaching now becomes an opportunity for both teachers to see every child every day. It does take a lot of planning. So be prepared for that. But once you get that rhythm, it's my favorite one to do. I love station teaching. And then there's team teaching, and team teaching, both teachers are sharing the content. So to give you a real life example, Laurie and I are team teaching you today. We both have all the content and we're sharing our roles, and we're sharing it in such a way that if I don't understand it, she can break it down and maybe then I can understand it, and vice versa. So each one of these 6 models has its own uniqueness, but you have to find within you and your co-teacher which one is best for you guys.
You know what's missing from that last example are kidney tables. In that little visual, if you guys remember kidney tables, that was like the key. It was like those little round tables where you it's in the middle and the kids sit around. That's what I always had in my classroom, and it was hysterical because it was like everybody wanted kidney tables. Did not want this rectangle, but you wanted to, like, you know, touch and you know, have access to kids all around. So I feel like that picture is a little inaccurate because I'm used to the kidney tables.
Yeah, I still have a kidney table.
Oh, I love it. Yep, that's good. So there's a lot of terminology in the work that we do. And we know this, whether we're early childhood, if we're preschool, if we're working with toddlers and babies, if we're, you know, teaching high school. There's so many acronyms. There's so much involved in differentiating and finding those chunking and the different skills that we can access and provide to our students. There's a difference between accommodations and modifications, and we're going to get into that briefly towards the end. But I think that at this point, for those that maybe are hearing this for the first time, or it's a refresher, or for anyone really, I think some of the tips that we wanted to share at this point is that it's okay to ask questions. If you're in your workplace and you don't know maybe what your administrator or your director is asking for, ask questions. Listen to the concerns of the parent. There is nothing more important from the parent's perspective that the teacher cares and they're listening to their concerns. So I think that's probably one of the best tips of the night. Take time as a professional to reflect. As a teacher, I used to keep a journal because there'd be days where I'd come home and I would just be like, oh my gosh, what happened? So reflect. What did you learn? What was good? What was not so good? And so did I make strides that day, or was it just a terrible day all around? It's okay not to have all the answers. Teachers are high achievers. In my experience, I always have seen that. 99% of teachers want to make it right, and we want to help and fix everything. And we feel like we need to have those answers. So it's okay to give yourself permission to say, like, I don't know. Let me find out. I'll get back to you. Let me do a little research on that. And then find what works. Every teacher's different. Everybody in this room today has different strategies, has a different style of teaching, and it's so individual. And that's why sometimes it's okay to ask questions as well, because we can learn from each other.
All right, so as Laurie said, there's a lot of terms, and we're first going to start with what we're referring to as alphabet soup. In special education always has its acronyms. Special education is no different, and we actually add additional acronyms. But we went through and kind of picked out the ones that you're going to see most often as that general education teacher of record. So the BIP, that is the behavior intervention plan. And what that does is gives everybody that is working with a child with a behavior disorder a plan to keep that student from getting off track. Whether that means that you're writing this plan to say, hey, we're going to limit the amount of times he goes to the bathroom, or hey, we need to extinguish the fact that he's a runner and wants to run away all the time, or, you know, blurting out, or whatever it is might be. It can be as simple as he annoys everybody by asking too many questions. What plan are we going to put into place to allow him to still ask questions, but just not take over the room with them? And to figure out what that is, we conduct what is called a FUBA. And FUBA is an FBA, or functional behavior assessment. And this is where that one teach, one observe comes in, because that teacher that's observing and documenting the behaviors, you're putting a graph together to figure out what triggers that behavior, what helps extinguish that behavior, so that you can write an informed working behavior intervention plan document. You've also got the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, and that's the entire document for this specific child. I like to think of the IEP as that child's individual curriculum. So not only are they learning what the state says they have to learn, but now there's these extra goals and objectives to get them to that grade level they're supposed to be. And it's the map of how they're going to get there. You've got least restrictive environment, LRE, and least restrictive environment is the student's placement. Are they staying in the general education setting with the general education teacher and a special education teacher in the room? Are they getting pulled out into a resource room for additional intensive instruction? Can they not handle general population at all? And do they need to be in what we consider a self-contained setting where they're learning life skills, such as tying your shoes, how to feed yourself? So that all comes in when you are creating the IEP. The IFSP, the Individualized Family Service Plan, those are for those children that are early identified, as we said early on, that follows them into school, but gives the family the first set of plans to get that student where they want to be prior to entering school.
So exactly what is differentiation? Sometimes we learn about that in school and sometimes we don't. And then you get into the workplace and your director, your teacher, or your administrator says, okay, well, you've got to differentiate. And we go away and we think, what in the world is that? How do I do that? That sounds really complicated. And it can be if you make it that way. But some of the ways or tips that we have for you today is really identifying like how we can adapt that instruction to meet those individual needs of the student, like we've been talking all along. And some of that can be the way that you teach the content, the way that students begin to absorb the content by different multisensory activities. Again, the environment, nature, we've heard so many great tips about that in the previous session. I am so excited to go outside now and play in my garden. So I love it. There's a lot to do to learn about and consider the process. Are we singing songs? Are we getting out of our chairs? Are we partnering? Are we playing games? So process is important as well. What's the end result? What do we want our students to know and be able to do? It doesn't matter what age, but we as educators have to realize what is it that is appropriate for that age, and then how do we get them sort of backwards map into that. Different groupings, we've talked about that, and the different co-teaching options can provide some of that sort of differentiating of the instruction and the supports that are needed. And of course, the classroom environment. Almost every classroom, except for our high school classrooms, typically are so print rich. There's so many activities, there's so much play. And by play, I mean like trucks and trains and dolls and kitchens and all kinds of good stuff. And so, and I'm preaching to the choir right now. You guys always have the best stuff. And so how we use that, how we structure that, how we chunk that information is so important. And so thinking about, especially if you're an early childhood educator, how can I use my time? We know that students' attention is so limited at that age. And so how can we really implement that in a really fun, meaningful way for our kids? I think I have the next one too. So here's a really good little visual that it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but again, just some tips. Know your kids, know what they need, know what they like. Sometimes that's hard at the beginning of the year, or if you have a lot of transiency in your classrooms, but know what they like, what's motivating for them, what's fun at that age level. And you as a teacher can really model that, your energy, your fun, exciting presence in the classroom could be so powerful. Assess them. We don't have to do a formal assessment. We can watch them. If we're co-teaching, use one of the models to really have someone observe and say, hey, Johnny is really picking on Sally. What can I do to sort of intervene and support that? Have adjustable assignments, some of those concepts that I just shared. Questioning strategies. Often our little ones have a hard time with why questions, right? That's a higher level order thinking. Or kids with developmental challenges, those why questions. But think about the others. How did this happen? When did this happen? Sequencing stories. You read a story. What came first? What then happened? What was the final? What was the resolution? What was the moral of the story? Those kinds of things. And then some of those curricular approaches that we sort of talked about, but using your own creativity, using your expertise, knowing your learner, that's the key.
All right, so we have talked a lot about differentiation and, kind of what that looks like. Well, with that, you are going to hear the terms modification and accommodation. And there is a difference in those two. However, most educators do not understand that there is a difference in what that difference is. So when you're working with students with disabilities and their IEPs and their BIPs and all of that, a modification alters the curriculum. So modification should really only be used for those students that are in that self-contained setting that are learning things like tying their shoes, how to dress themselves, because you are altering what it is they need to know to be successful in the future. Whereas an accommodation, you are making the curriculum accessible. You can give breaks, you can enlarge print, but what you cannot do is with an accommodation is adjust the grading or adjust the curriculum and say, hey, instead of learning sight words, we're going to go back and learn our letters. No, that would be a modification of the curriculum. But an accommodation of that same learning your sight words, you give the entire class all 50 pre-primer sight words, but you only give this certain individual half of them or a third of them or a quarter of them. So you're just chunking it to make it more accessible and not overwhelm the student.
So really some final thoughts is there's so much to this topic that 40 minutes isn't really going to cover all of it. But again, more tips, lots of questions probably than there is answers. And as all of us in the room too, again, preaching to the choir, that we often walk away and we think, wow, what am I supposed to do? How do I solve that problem? And that's why teaching is such an exciting profession, is because it's always changing. So some of the tips, and I'll just do maybe like the first two, and Andrea, if you want to do the other ones, is don't be afraid. Like we said, don't be afraid to ask questions. What's that? How can I find more information? Who do I go to see a model of that? It's always super interesting. And communication, talk to each other, talk to the parents, talk to the students, and just really put yourself out there. It's so important.
Know the legislation. So special education can get your certificate revoked in a heartbeat should the parent challenge anything. You need to make sure that your I's are dotted, T's are crossed, G's have their hooks, all of it. Have an arsenal of strategies. So general education toolbox is big. Our toolbox has to be at least twice that size, if not 3 or 4 times that size. And be open to change. Change. Not only does the curriculum change, the child changes. The child changes as they learn. So yeah, you've got to be on your toes, and change can happen in a split second, especially with those students with challenging behaviors. We never know what's going to set them off. I've gone from wearing regular shoes to, I have 3 runners this year. I wore my running shoes every day because I knew I was taking off at some point in the day.
I had a student, and I'll just share, and I was in a special education classroom, K through 3, huge range. And I had a student who would, when she would get mad, she would strip off her clothes and she would urinate. She'd go out on the playground and just urinate, and it was horrible. But before she would engage in that behavior, she would pick up the plastic fruit that we had in the classroom and start trying to peg people. So we had to devise a way to help support her and prevent and change that behavior. So there's never a dull moment, and you know that just as much as we do. So I'm not sure if Andrea got frozen there or if I'm frozen.
No, I'm here. I may have gotten frozen.
Okay.
Am I there?
Yeah, you're there. So we
Okay.
included our emails if anybody's interested in more information, or you need resources, or you just want to chat. Let us know. We're happy to entertain anything that you have. And I know we have a couple minutes left, and there's a lot of hot topics out there. So if you have any questions, just let us know.